They threw you into the fire not because you were weak, but because they believed the flames would erase you. They mistook silence for surrender and kindness for fragility. In their minds, the fire was meant to be final, an ending, a punishment, a lesson meant to humble you into disappearing. They did not imagine that fire, when met by a soul anchored in truth, does not destroy. It reveals, it refines. It separates what is false from what is real. Fire has always frightened those who rely on appearances. It strips away masks, it exposes intentions. And that is why they pushed you toward it with such confidence. They assumed that heat would make you frantic, bitter, small. They assumed pain would turn you cruel or obedient, but something they never accounted for happened in the quiet moments when no one was watching. You did not burn the way they expected. You did not scream for mercy. You stood there, wounded but awake, learning truths they have never had the courage to face. There is a strange mercy hidden inside suffering. It forces honesty. When everything comfortable is taken away, what remains is who you truly are. In that fire, you discovered that your worth was never granted by their approval and therefore could not be revoked by their rejection. You learned that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it survives in stillness. While they congratulated themselves on your downfall, you were being reshaped from the inside out, gaining a depth they will never understand. They thought the fire belonged to them, that it was a weapon under their control. But fire answers to higher laws than human intention. It burns according to truth, not malice, and slowly, imperceptibly at first, the fire turned its attention away from you. The same cruelty they used as fuel began to consume their own peace. The same lies they spread to justify their actions began to choke them. What they threw at you returned, not by revenge, but by consequence. You see it now in the restlessness behind their smiles, in the tension they carry even in moments meant for joy. They cannot rest because unresolved guilt is a relentless companion. They cannot escape the heat because it follows them into quiet rooms and sleepless nights. You walked through the fire and emerged altered. They built their lives around it and are now trapped inside it. There is a difference between passing through flames and making them your home. This is the irony they never anticipated. The fire that was meant to define you ended up defining them. You learned restraint where they practiced excess. You learned humility where they chose arrogance. You learned endurance while they relied on control. And now, without you lifting a finger, the world begins to mirror these inner truths. You breathe more freely, not because life is perfect, but because you are no longer afraid of losing what never truly mattered. Do not misunderstand this moment. This is not triumph born of pride, nor justice fueled by bitterness. It is simply the natural order restoring itself. Fire reveals, fire returns, fire teaches. You were willing to walk through it and let it change you. They only knew how to throw others into it and walk away. And so the lesson completes itself, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that cannot be argued with. You are no longer standing in the flames. You are standing in clarity. And they, whether they admit it or not, are still burning. Not because you wished it so, but because they refused to become anything more than what they were when they struck the match. They mistook your silence for weakness, and in doing so, revealed how little they understood the nature of strength. They saw you step back, not retaliate, not shout your innocence from rooftops, and they assumed fear had taken hold of you. To them, silence was an admission of defeat. In their world, only the loud survive, only the aggressive endure. Only those who strike first remain standing. They never pause to consider that silence can be chosen. that restraint can be deliberate, that calm can exist not because a person is broken, but because they are grounded. They believe destruction would erase you, that if they applied enough pressure, spread enough doubt, inflicted enough emotional heat, you would fold inward and disappear. They expected you to shrink, to compromise your values, to betray yourself just to regain comfort. Their cruelty was calculated, but shallow. It relied on the assumption that your sense of self was as fragile as their own. They imagined that if they damaged your reputation, questioned your intentions, or isolated you emotionally, you would lose your footing and beg for relief. What they never understood was that your silence was not emptiness, it was depth. Silence for you was not the absence of thought, it was the presence of discernment. You were watching, weighing, understanding. While they were busy crafting narratives about you, you were learning truths about them. You saw how easily they mistook control for power and noise for authority. You noticed how their confidence required an audience, how their certainty collapsed when questioned, how their need to dominate revealed a fear of being exposed. Your silence denied them the reaction they craved, and that denial unsettled them more than any argument ever could. They thought weakness always looks gentle. They assumed kindness must be naive, patience must be passive, and humility must be hollow. They never learned that some people do not fight every battle because they are afraid to lose, but because they are selective about what deserves their energy. You understood that responding to every provocation binds you to the very chaos you are trying to escape. Remaining silent was not surrender, it was refusal, a refusal to let your identity be shaped by their hostility. In their minds, destruction is loud, it demands spectacle, it announces itself. And so they expected you to collapse visibly, publicly, dramatically. When that did not happen, confusion set in. They mistook your composure for denial, your steadiness for numbness. They did not see the internal labor taking place within you, the quiet reordering of values, the slow strengthening of boundaries, the painful but necessary shedding of illusions. Silence gave you room to process without distortion, to grieve without performance, to heal without interference. There is something deeply unsettling to those who rely on dominance when their target refuses to react as expected. Your silence removed their sense of control. It forced them to sit with their own intentions without distraction. They wanted resistance so they could justify escalation. They wanted retaliation so they could claim victimhood. Instead, they were met with restraint, and restraint exposes motive. Without your participation, their actions stood alone, unmasked and undeniable. They believed erasure was possible because they never understood presence. You were never defined by proximity, approval, or validation. Your silence did not diminish you, it concentrated you. It allowed you to hear your own conscience more clearly, to reconnect with principles that do not depend on external agreement. While they interpreted silence as absence, it was actually preparation. While they assumed you were retreating, you were recalibrating. What they failed to grasp is that silence is often where endurance is born. It is where one learns to exist without applause, to remain intact without affirmation, to stand without witnesses. In that quiet, you were not losing yourself. You were finding yourself, piece by piece, away from the noise of judgment, and all the while they were mistaking still waters for shallow ones, unaware that depth does not announce itself, and strength does not always need to be seen to be real. The fire they chose for you was never meant to purify, it was meant to humiliate, to expose you in a way that would leave you ashamed and defenseless. They imagined flames as instruments of control, believing that pressure would force you to conform, to confess faults you did not own, to accept labels they were eager to attach. In their thinking, fire was a spectacle, something dramatic enough to convince others that you deserved what was happening to you. They trusted heat more than truth, intensity more than integrity, but fire has a way of revealing intentions long before it reveals outcomes. What they did not understand is that flames do not discriminate between the innocent and the guilty based on accusation. They separate based on substance. When the fire touched your life, it did not consume your essence. It exposed the falseness surrounding you. It burned away the borrowed opinions, the fragile alliances, the shallow agreements that existed only when you were useful or compliant. What remained was quieter, but far more real. They expected the fire to define you by your pain. Instead, it defined them by their motives. As the heat rose, so did the truth of who stood with you and who merely stood near you. Those who relied on appearances retreated. Those who thrived on convenience disappeared. The fire stripped away the illusion that everyone who smiles means well, that proximity equals loyalty, that familiarity guarantees care. This exposure was painful, not because you lost something valuable, but because you discovered how much of what surrounded you was hollow. There is a particular crew, LTI, in believing that suffering will force a person to accept lies. They assumed the fire would distort your sense of reality, that fear would rewrite your memory, that isolation would make you doubt what you knew to be true. Yet fire, when endured without surrendering conscience, sharpens perception. You began to see patterns where once you saw coincidences. You noticed how narratives were constructed, how blame was redirected, how truth was softened or exaggerated depending on who benefited. The fire trained your sight. What they thought was exposure of your weakness became exposure of their falsehood. In the heat, contradictions surfaced, stories no longer aligned, justifications sounded rehearsed. The very effort to prove you wrong revealed how much effort was required to maintain the illusion. Fire demands consistency, and lies are expensive to sustain under pressure. While you were forced to confront your pain honestly, they were forced to perform theirs convincingly. That imbalance could not last. You began to understand that much of what once felt solid was only ever supported by comfort. When comfort vanished, so did conviction. People who spoke confidently in calm conditions faltered when heat arrived. Principles they claimed to live by bent easily. Promises dissolved. The fire did not invent these weaknesses, it merely illuminated them. What had been hidden behind routine and politeness was now visible in stark relief. They believed exposure would shame you into silence. Instead, it taught you discernment. You learned what did not deserve your trust, what did not merit your vulnerability, what could not be relied upon when things became difficult. The fire refined your boundaries. It showed you that openness without wisdom invites harm, and loyalty without truth becomes self-betrayal. These were lessons they never intended to give you, yet lessons you carry. Now with clarity, in trying to expose you, they exposed the emptiness of their own foundations. Their values could not survive heat because they were never rooted deeply. Their confidence depended on agreement. Their authority depended on compliance. Their righteousness depended on comparison. Fire dismantles such structures effortlessly. It does not argue, it reveals. And as the flames continued to work, it became clear that what was being reduced to ash was not your identity, but the false framework built around controlling it. The fire they chose became a mirror. It reflected back the intentions behind every word, every action, every calculated silence. You were not undone by this revelation. You were clarified by it. What was false could not remain hidden. What was shallow could not endure. And though the heat was never gentle, it was honest. And honesty, once encountered, cannot be unlearned. Suffering stripped away illusions and revealed a strength you did not know you possessed. Not all at once, but slowly, almost unwillingly. At first, it felt like loss rather than discovery. Things you once trusted no longer held. Assumptions you lived by began to crumble. The world you thought was solid developed cracks, and through those cracks came discomfort, confusion, and a quiet fear that perhaps you had been wrong about more than you realized. Yet this stripping was not cruel for the sake of cruelty. It was precise. It removed only what could not survive truth. Illusions are comfortable because they simplify life. They tell us who to trust, what to expect, how things are supposed to work. When suffering arrives, it does not ask permission before dismantling these comforts. It interrupts routines, challenges beliefs, and forces questions we would rather avoid. You discovered that much of what once gave you a sense of safety was borrowed. Borrowed from approval, ed from stability, borrowed from the idea that good intentions are always rewarded. When those illusions fell away, you were left face to face with yourself, without the usual distractions. At first, this encounter felt like emptiness. Without illusions, there was silence, and silence can be frightening when one is not used to standing alone. But within that silence, something unexpected began to form. You noticed that even without reassurance, you were still standing. Even without certainty, you were still breathing. Even without validation, you were still intact. This realization did not arrive with confidence or celebration. It arrived quietly, like a fact that could not be argued with. You were surviving without the very things you once thought essential. Strength, you learned, is not always something you feel. Often it is something you discover only after it has already been operating. You did not wake up one day feeling powerful. You woke up tired, unsure, and yet still willing to face another day. That willingness became evidence. Each moment you endured without becoming what hurt you added weight to a truth you had never tested before. You were more anchored than you believed. The strength was not dramatic. It was persistent. Suffering also removed the illusion that resilience must look impressive. You had imagined strength as confidence, clarity, decisiveness. What you found instead was endurance mixed with doubt, courage paired with fear, resolve existing alongside grief. You learned that strength does not cancel pain, it carries pain without letting it dictate direction. This realization changed how you saw yourself. You stopped measuring your worth by how unaffected you appeared and began recognizing the quiet dignity of continuing despite being affected. As illusions fell, responsibility returned to you in a new way. Without false expectations, you could no longer blame disappointment on surprise alone. You began to see patterns, not as punishments, but as information. You understood why certain dynamics repeated, why certain people reacted as they did, why certain hopes were misplaced. This clarity did not harden you, it grounded you. It allowed you to engage the world with fewer fantasies and more wisdom. You also discovered a strength in restraint that illusions had once obscured. When you believed fairness was guaranteed, anger felt justified when it failed. When that illusion dissolved, you learned to choose your responses more carefully, not because you were indifferent, but because you understood the cost of reaction. You learned that not every injustice requires your immediate involvement, and not every wound needs to be displayed to be real. This discretion was not avoidance, it was maturity forged under pressure. Suffering exposed another illusion, that identity is fixed and fragile. You realized instead that identity is resilient, capable of adaptation without losing essence. Parts of you changed, yes, but the core remained. You did not become smaller. You became more precise, less scattered, less dependent on being understood, more capable of standing in complexity without collapsing into it. What emerged from the stripping away was not a hardened version of yourself, but a clearer one. You saw what could be lost and what could not. You learned where your limits were, and more importantly, where they were not. The strength revealed was not loud enough for others to notice immediately, but it was solid enough to carry you forward without apology. In the fire, you learned that your worth was never granted by their approval, and therefore it could never be taken away by their rejection. This truth did not arrive as comfort, it arrived as confrontation. For a long time you had believed, perhaps without realizing it, that being seen, accepted, or affirmed by certain people gave you legitimacy. Their smiles felt like permission, their silence felt like judgment. And when the fire came, it burned straight through that quiet dependence, leaving nowhere to hide from the question you had avoided. Who are you when no one is clapping? At first, the loss of approval felt like losing oxygen. You noticed how deeply human approval had been woven into your sense of stability. When it vanished, the emptiness was alarming. You questioned yourself more harshly than anyone else ever had. You replayed conversations, reinterpreted moments, searched for flaws that might explain why approval had been withdrawn. This is how approval keeps its grip, by convincing us that our value is always conditional, always pending review. But the fire does something relentless. It removes what cannot sustain itself without constant reinforcement. Approval requires maintenance. It needs performance, compliance, agreement. And in the heat, maintaining performance becomes impossible. You were too busy surviving to keep pretending, too honest in pain to keep polishing an image. And so the approval fell away, not because you failed, but because you stopped feeding it. What followed was unsettling freedom. Without approval as a compass, you had to listen to something older and quieter, conscience. You had to ask whether your actions were right, not whether they were praised, whether your choices were truthful, not whether they were popular. This shift was uncomfortable because it removed excuses. You could no longer hide behind validation or rejection. You had to stand by what you believed, even when it cost you comfort. Slowly, you began to see how approval distorts judgment. You noticed how often people say what is safe, rather than what is true. How often they choose acceptance over integrity. How quickly principle soften when belonging is threatened. And you realize that the approval you lost was never neutral. It had expectations attached, conditions, silent contracts you were expected to honor without consent. Losing that approval was not a loss of worth, it was the cancellation of a bargain you never agreed to. The fire taught you something else as well. That worth is not experienced as a feeling before it is lived as a decision. You did not suddenly feel valuable. You acted as if your value was non-negotiable. You stopped explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You stopped shrinking your truth to fit into rooms that only welcomed fragments. This behavior felt risky at first, almost arrogant, because you were accustomed to earning your place. But over time, it felt honest. You also learned how approval can make people complicit in their own diminishment. You saw how often you had tolerated subtle disrespect, rationalized dismissive behavior, or minimized your own discomfort just to keep peace. The fire removed your patience for that kind of self-erasure. Not because you became harsh, but because you became clear. You understood that peace, purchased with silence, about what matters is not peace at all, it is postponement. As approval loosened its grip, something steadier took its place: self-respect. Self-respect does not need consensus, it does not fluctuate with moods or trends. It does not disappear when misunderstood. It simply insists that you remain aligned with what you know to be true. This alignment did not make life easier, but it made it cleaner. Decisions became simpler, even when outcomes were uncertain. You noticed, too, how some people reacted when approval no longer controlled you. They were confused by your calm, threatened by your boundaries, frustrated that guilt no longer moved you. This reaction confirmed what the fire had already shown you: approval as a tool of influence, and those who rely on it struggle when it loses power. Your refusal to beg for it exposed how much control it once provided them. What emerged was not isolation, but independence of spirit. You could now receive appreciation without being ruled by it, and endure criticism without being crushed by it. Praise became pleasant rather than necessary. Rejection became informative rather than defining. This balance did not come from confidence alone, but from the deep understanding that your worth existed long before anyone noticed and will remain long after opinions change. The fire did not give you worth. It removed the lie that worth was ever something others could give. Pain refined your character while comfort had only preserved theirs. And this difference became clearer the longer the fire burned. Comfort has a way of freezing people in place. It rewards familiarity, protects habits, and discourages reflection. When life is gentle, there is little reason to question oneself, little pressure to grow beyond what already works. Comfort maintains what exists, it rarely transforms it. Those who remained comfortable never had to examine their motives, their fears, or the quiet compromises they made to stay where they were. Pain, however, refuses to preserve illusions. It presses inward. It asks questions comfort never dares to ask. When pain entered your life, it did not politely knock. It dismantled. It forced you to confront reactions you did not like in yourself, attachments you did not realize you had, expectations you had carried without scrutiny. This was not refinement by praise, but refinement by resistance. Each hardship acted like friction, shaping you through endurance rather than affirmation. You noticed how pain demanded honesty. When things hurt deeply enough, pretending becomes exhausting. You could no longer afford shallow explanations or convenient lies, not even to yourself. Pain stripped language down to what was necessary. It exposed where you had been naive, where you had trusted without wisdom, where you had given more than was sustainable. This exposure was uncomfortable, but it was precise. It showed you where growth was required, not where appearance needed adjusting. While you were being refined, others remained unchanged because nothing required them to change. Comfort protected their narratives. It allowed them to believe they were kind without being tested, strong without being challenged, right without being questioned. Their identities rested on unexamined assumptions. Yours was being rebuilt under pressure. That rebuilding was slow, often painful, but it was real. You were not adding layers. You were removing weaknesses disguised as virtues. Pain taught you patience of a different kind. Not the patience that waits passively, but the patience that endures without becoming resentful. You learned how to sit with discomfort without immediately trying to escape it. This skill did not make you indifferent, it made you stable. You stopped reacting impulsively because you understood the cost of reaction. You learned to pause, to think, to choose responses that aligned with who you were becoming rather than who you were provoked to be. Refinement also altered how you viewed others. Pain gave you empathy without sentimentality. You could recognize suffering without excusing harm. You understood weakness without allowing it to rule you. This balance came from having seen your own vulnerability up close. You no longer needed to prove superiority because pain had already humbled you. Nor did you need to submit because pain had already strengthened you. You met people more clearly, without the distortion of either fear or pride. Comfort had never required them to develop depth. Preserved by ease, they remained dependent on circumstances staying favorable. When challenged, they reacted defensively, because their sense of self had never been tested. Pain had trained you differently. It had shown you that identity cannot rely on external stability. It must be portable, capable of surviving change. This understanding made you adaptable where others were brittle. You also noticed how pain refined your sense of responsibility. You stopped expecting the world to compensate you for being good. You stopped assuming fairness would arrive automatically. Instead, you focused on alignment, doing what was right because it was right, not because it guaranteed reward. This shift freed you from constant disappointment. You no longer measured life by outcomes alone, but by integrity maintained under pressure. Pain sharpened your discernment. You became less impressed by words and more attentive to patterns, less moved by promises and more observant of behavior. This was not cynicism, it was clarity earned the hard way. Comfort had allowed others to remain impressed by surfaces. Pain taught you to look beneath them. It refined your ability to tell the difference between sincerity and performance, between strength and posturing. Through refinement, you became quieter but not smaller, more deliberate but not rigid, less reactive but more aware. Pain did not erase your softness, it protected it by giving it boundaries. You learned how to remain open without being unguarded, kind without being careless, firm without being cruel. These are qualities comfort rarely produces because they require friction to form. While comfort preserved them in familiar shapes, pain reshaped you into something more durable, not flawless, not untouched, but grounded. The refinement was not visible to everyone, and it did not need to be. It lived in how you carried yourself, how you chose silence over spectacle, how you responded with intention rather than impulse. Pain had done its work quietly, and what it left behind was not bitterness, but substance. What they used as a weapon became the place where your identity was forged, though at the time it felt more like an execution than a beginning. They believed pressure would collapse you, that exposure would distort you, that sustained hostility would make you abandon yourself just to find relief. In their minds, the weapon was perfectly chosen. It struck at your vulnerabilities, targeted what mattered to you, and lingered long enough to exhaust resistance. They expected erosion. What they produced instead was definition. Weapons are designed to break things quickly, but identity is not brittle in the way objects are. It does not shatter on impact. It forms under repetition. Each strike forced you to ask questions you had never fully answered before. What do I stand for when it costs me something? What remains when I am misunderstood? What do I refuse to become, even if becoming it would make life easier? These questions were not theoretical. They arrived daily, sometimes hourly, demanding lived answers rather than thoughtful ones. At first, the weapon felt external, words spoken, actions taken, exclusions enforced. But over time, you realized the real pressure was internal. You were being pressed to compromise, to adapt in ways that would make the pain stop. The temptation was subtle, not a call to abandon everything, but to soften truths, dilute convictions, accept distortions for the sake of peace. The weapon worked slowly, testing not your strength, but your coherence. Could you remain the same person across changing conditions, or would you fragment to survive? Each time you chose coherence, something solidified. You did not feel it happening, but it was happening. Identity is rarely forged in moments of confidence. It is forged in moments of hesitation where a choice still has to be made. You learned that being yourself was not a static trait, but a repeated act. Every refusal to retaliate blindly, every decision to remain honest when dishonesty would have protected you, added weight to who you were becoming. The weapon also revealed how much of identity is shaped unconsciously until it is tested. Before, you may have believed certain things about yourself without ever proving them. You thought you were patient, kind, principled. But it was only under sustained pressure that those traits either collapsed or strengthened. Some habits fell away because they were never part of your core. Others endured because they were. The weapon did not create these traits, it clarified them. You began to recognize that identity forged without resistance is often borrowed. It comes from roles assigned, praise received, expectations met. When those supports were removed, borrowed identity dissolved. What remained had to be built deliberately. This was exhausting work. There were days when holding onto yourself required more energy than enduring the attack itself. Yet that effort was formative. You were no longer assuming who you were choosing it. What surprised you most was how the weapon trained your discernment. You learned when to speak and when silence preserved integrity. You learned when flexibility was wisdom and when it was self-erasure. You learned that not every fight strengthens identity, some merely entangle it. The weapon taught you selectivity. It forced you to distinguish between defending ego and protecting essence. This distinction became central to who you are. There was also an unexpected narrowing that occurred. The weapon reduced excess. You stopped scattering your energy trying to be understood by everyone. You stopped explaining yourself to those committed to misunderstanding you. Identity requires focus, and pressure provided it. You learned where to invest yourself and where to withdraw without guilt. This was not isolation, it was precision. As time passed, the weapon lost its power, not because it disappeared, but because it no longer dictated your responses. You had adapted internally. The same tactics that once destabilized you now met something firm, not hardness, but rootedness. They could still hurt, but they could not reshape you against your will. Identity had formed contours strong enough to resist distortion. What they never understood is that weapons shape both the target and the wielder. While you were being forged, they were becoming dependent on the act of striking. Their sense of control relied on your reaction. When that reaction changed, the weapon lost meaning. It no longer defined the situation. It merely revealed the distance between who you had become and who they remained. The place they chose to undo you became the place where you learned continuity, how to remain yourself across fear, loss, and uncertainty. Identity formed there was not loud or theatrical. It was quiet, dense, and difficult to move. And once formed, it no longer needed protection through force because it had already survived it. Fire answers to truth, not cruelty, and this is what makes it so frightening to those who wield harm as a strategy. Cruelty assumes control. It believes that intention alone determines outcome, that power can be directed without consequence, that damage can be inflicted without echo. Those who act cruelly trust that force obeys them. They imagine fire as a tool, something to unleash and then walk away from, untouched. But fire has never belonged to human intention. It obeys reality, not desire. Truth is weighty. It settles, it endures, it cannot be outrun. Fire is drawn to it. Heat is drawn to substance. When flames are set loose, they do not ask who started them. They reveal what is real. They burn away what is hollow and linger where there is depth. Cruelty, by contrast, is often empty at its core. It relies on impulse, fear, insecurity, or resentment. It makes noise, but it lacks substance. When fire meets cruelty, it does not strengthen it, it exposes it. This is why those who harm others often underestimate time. They believe the moment of impact is the moment of victory. They confuse immediate effect with final outcome. Fire, however, is patient. It does not need to rush. It works inward, quietly, often unnoticed at first. While attention is focused on the one who was harmed, fire begins its slow return journey, drawn by unresolved truth. It moves toward guilt denied, motives concealed, lies repeated until believed. It follows the path of dishonesty back to its source. You witness this without having to orchestrate it. While you were forced to confront pain honestly, others avoided self-examination. While you asked difficult questions of yourself, they justified their actions with excuses. This difference mattered. Truth welcomed the fire in you. Cruelty resisted it in them, and resistance does not extinguish fire, it concentrates it. What is refused inwardly becomes external pressure. What is denied internally manifests as unrest. Fire returning does not always look dramatic. It rarely arrives with spectacle. More often, it appears as erosion. Restlessness replaces confidence. Justifications multiply. Peace becomes difficult to sustain. Relationships strain under unspoken tension. The same traits that once empowered cruelty, control, manipulation, certainty begin to backfire. Control breeds paranoia. Manipulation breeds mistrust. Certainty hardens into rigidity. Fire works through these cracks, not violently, but relentlessly. Those who act cruelly often believe that as long as they appear unchallenged, they are untouched. But fire does not care about appearances. It operates beneath them. It reveals itself in the inability to rest, in the constant need to defend past actions, in the quiet anxiety that surfaces when distractions fade. The fire they released returns as internal heat, unresolved, unnamed, persistent. It does not announce itself as punishment. It simply refuses to leave. Truth, on the other hand, gives fire direction rather than resistance. When you faced what was real, your pain, your limits, your values, you allowed the fire to pass through rather than settle. This did not make the experience gentle, but it made it transformative. Fire moved through you because there was nothing false for it to cling to. It refined rather than consumed. It left clarity instead of residue. This is why fire always finds its rightful owner, not because of moral arithmetic, but because of alignment. Fire seeks what cannot withstand exposure. It lingers where truth is avoided. It returns to the places built on distortion because distortion cannot dissipate heat. The one who accepts truth absorbs the lesson and releases the flame. The one who rejects truth traps it. There is a deep injustice in cruelty that fire cannot ignore, not an injustice defined by rules or systems, but one rooted in imbalance. Cruelty takes without accounting. It harms without acknowledgement. Fire restores balance by forcing recognition. It compels awareness where there was denial. It demands payment in the currency of attention, peace, or stability. Not as revenge, but as correction. You may have noticed how the fire's return is often misunderstood by those experiencing it. They blame circumstances, other people, bad luck. They do not see the continuity between what they released and what now surrounds them. Fire rarely educate. Those unwilling to learn, It simply persists. It stays close, reshaping the environment until truth can no longer be avoided. Meanwhile, your relationship with fire has changed. You no longer fear it in the same way. You understand its language. You know that pain confronted loses its power to follow you. You recognize that honesty, though costly, shortens the life of flames. Fire no longer needs to chase you, because it has already done its work. Fire answers to truth, not cruelty, and because truth cannot be owned, fire cannot be controlled. It returns not to punish, but to reveal where reality has been ignored too long. While you passed through the flames, they built their lives around malice and became trapped by it, though at first it looked like advantage. Malice often disguises itself as strategy. It convinces people that harm is efficient, that cruelty is clever, that manipulation is a shortcut to security. They did not see themselves as prisoners, they saw themselves as architects. Every action felt justified, every decision felt necessary, every compromise felt temporary. They believed malice was a tool they could pick up and put down at will. You, on the other hand, never settled in the fire. You did not make a home of pain. You did not organize your identity around what was done to you. You moved through the flames because survival demanded movement. Each step hurt, but each step carried you forward. You were changed by the fire, yes, but you did not orient your life around it. You refused to let suffering become your compass. That refusal mattered more than you realized at the time. They stayed. They lingered. They learned how to live in heat without questioning why it was there. Malice became familiar. It shaped their routines, their conversations, their assumptions about others. Suspicion replaced trust. Control replaced connection. They began to anticipate conflict even when none existed, because a life built on harm must always defend itself. When cruelty becomes structure, peace becomes a threat. At first, this structure felt powerful. Malice gives a false sense of clarity. It divides the world neatly into allies and enemies, winners and fools. It simplifies complexity into dominance. But simplification comes at a cost. Over time, everything must be interpreted through that narrow lens. Every disagreement feels like betrayal. Every silence feels like opposition. Every success of another feels like an attack. The walls they built for protection slowly closed in. You note, said the difference in how time treated you both. For you, time softened the burn. It allowed reflection, healing, recalibration. For them, time hardened the structure. Each unresolved act required another justification. Each justification demanded reinforcement. Malice is expensive to maintain. It consumes attention, energy, and imagination. It leaves little room for rest, because vigilance must be constant. Living inside malice distorts perception. They began to see threat where there was none, to hear insult where there was only difference. Relationships became transactional, valued only for usefulness. Joy became conditional. Even moments meant for celebration carried an undercurrent of tension. Because malice does not know how to relax, it is always preparing for the next defense, always anticipating loss, always rehearsing grievance. You, having passed through the flames, learn something different. You learn that pain can be endured without becoming a worldview. You learn that suffering can inform without ruling. You did not deny what happened to you, but you did not let it define every interaction that followed. This allowed you to remain open where they became guarded, flexible where they became rigid. You moved forward. They fortified. Malice also narrowed their future. When harm becomes the foundation, possibilities shrink. Creativity requires trust. Growth requires risk. Vulnerability requires safety. Malice undermines all three. They became reactive rather than imaginative, defensive rather than exploratory. Life turned into maintenance rather than movement. Each day was about preserving position, not discovering meaning. They may not recognize this as imprisonment. From the inside, it feels like control. But control that requires constant enforcement is not freedom. It is labor without rest. It is vigilance without peace. It is power that can never be. Set down. You see it in the way they cannot disengage, cannot forget, cannot forgive. Not because forgiveness is undeserved, but because releasing malice would collapse the structure they built to hold themselves together. You passed through the fire because you did not cling to it. You did not let it become your language or your lens. They remained because malice offered them identity when self-examination felt too costly. And so the flames did what flames always do. They moved on from what could endure them and settled where there was nowhere else to go. Inner guilt quietly consumed their peace long after the moment of harm had passed. And this was the part they never prepared for. They believed that once the act was done, once the damage was inflicted and the situation moved on, the weight would lift. They assumed time would erase memory, that distraction would dull awareness, that justification would silence conscience. But guilt does not operate on schedules. It does not respond to explanations crafted for others. It lives deeper than reputation and survives long after the noise fades. At first, guilt is subtle. It does not announce itself as remorse. It appears as irritation, as restlessness, as an unnamed discomfort that refuses to leave. They felt it in moments that should have been calm, in silences that felt heavier than expected. They pushed it aside, telling themselves they did what was necessary, that you deserved it, that anyone in their position would have acted the same way. These explanations worked in public spaces where agreement could be borrowed. In private, they failed. Guilt thrives in the absence of honesty because they never faced what they had done truthfully. Guilt had no release. It did not transform into repentance or change. It hardened into unease. It followed them into ordinary moments, while resting, while laughing, while planning or the future. It surfaced when defenses were down, when there was no one to impress, no role to perform, no narrative to maintain. In those moments, the unresolved truth pressed inward. They discovered that peace cannot coexist with denial. Peace requires alignment between action and conscience. Guilt is the signal of misalignment, and silencing the signal does not correct the imbalance. It only increases internal noise. They became more reactive, more easily provoked, more defensive when questioned, not because they were being attacked, but because the truth inside them was already pressing for attention. You may have noticed how often they revisited the past, not openly, but indirectly. They repeated the same justifications, the same stories, the same accusations. This repetition was not confidence, it was rehearsal. Guilt demands constant explanation because it cannot rest on a single lie. Each retelling was an attempt to convince themselves that what happened was settled, yet the very need to repeat it revealed that it was not. Guilt also disrupted their ability to enjoy the present. Moments of happiness felt incomplete, as though something was missing. Success tasted thinner. Achievements felt strangely hollow. This is because guilt fractures attention. Part of the mind is always occupied with what must not be examined. Even pleasure becomes exhausting when it must coexist with avoidance. Joy requires presence, and guilt prevents full presence. They likely mistook this unrest for external pressure. They blamed circumstances, other people, bad timing. It never occurred to them that the discomfort was internal and precise. Guilt does not punish randomly. It presses exactly where truth has been avoided. It asks for acknowledgement, not suffering. But when acknowledgement is refused, suffering becomes the substitute. Sleep became more difficult. Stillness became audible. Silence felt invasive. These are common signs of unresolved guilt. Without distractions, the mind drifts toward what has been suppressed. They filled their time to avoid this drift. Noise became necessary. Activity became armor. But armor is heavy, and wearing it constantly drains energy. Over time, exhaustion replaced confidence. You, having confronted pain directly, did not carry this burden. Your suffering was visible, acknowledged, processed. Theirs was hidden, denied, and therefore persistent. This difference shaped your inner lives in opposite directions. Pain-faced loses intensity. Guilt avoided gains it. You learned how to sit with discomfort honestly. They learned how to run from it endlessly. Guilt also isolated them in subtle ways. It made genuine connection difficult because connection requires transparency. When parts of oneself must remain hidden, relationships become partial. Trust feels risky. Intimacy feels threatening. They remain surrounded yet alone, unable to fully relax into the presence of others. The cost of maintaining an unexamined self grew heavier with time. What they never realized is that guilt is not cruel, it is corrective. It exists to restore alignment, not to destroy peace. But correction requires humility, and humility was the one thing they refused, and so guilt did not leave. It stayed, quiet but persistent, shaping moods, decisions, and reactions from behind the scenes, slowly consuming the peace they believed they had protected by avoiding the truth. You emerged with clarity and restraint, not because the fire was kind, but because you allowed it to teach you without letting it rule you. Clarity did not arrive as certainty about everything, it arrived as certainty about what mattered. You no longer wasted energy guessing motives or chasing explanations that would never be honest. The confusion that once kept you awake. At night slowly lost its grip, not because answers were handed to you, but because you learned which questions were no longer worth asking. Restraint grew alongside that clarity. You learned the discipline of not reacting to every impulse, not answering every provocation, not correcting every false narrative. This restraint was not weakness disguised as calm, it was strength directed inward. You understood that reacting impulsively would bind you to the very chaos you were trying to leave behind. Each moment of restraint was a quiet assertion of freedom. You were no longer governed by what others did to you. Clarity taught you where your responsibility ended. You stopped carrying guilt that was never yours. You stopped assuming that someone else's cruelty required your explanation or repair. This was a profound shift. For a long time you had believed that understanding everything was necessary for peace. Now you saw that peace often comes from accepting what cannot be fixed, clarified, or redeemed by effort alone. Some truths do not need resolution, they need distance. They, by contrast, remained restless because their actions never found rest. When harm is done without accountability, it does not disappear, it circles. It revisits the mind in disguised forms: anxiety, irritation, defensiveness, suspicion. Their restlessness was not caused by you moving on, it was caused by them remaining tethered to what they had done. Every new situation was filtered through old justifications. Every challenge felt threatening because it echoed unresolved choices. You noticed how restraint gave you space. Space to think before speaking. Space to choose before acting. Space to observe without immediately judging. This space became protective. It allowed you to see patterns clearly rather than react emotionally to isolated events. You could tell the difference between what required engagement and what was merely noise. This discernment simplified life. Fewer battles felt necessary, fewer words needed to be spoken. They lacked this space because their actions demanded constant defense. When a person is bound to what they have done, they must remain vigilant. They cannot afford stillness, because stillness invites reflection. They cannot afford openness, because openness risks exposure. Their restlessness was not accidental, it was structural. It was built into the way they had chosen to live. Every interaction required calculation. Every pause required distraction. Clarity also reshaped how you saw yourself. You stopped defining your identity in opposition to theirs. You were no longer the one who was hurt or the one who survived. You were simply yourself, moving forward with intention. This was a quiet liberation. Your story no longer revolved around injury. It revolved around alignment. You acted in ways that made sense to you, regardless of whether they were understood or approved. Restraint gave your words weight. Because you spoke less impulsively, what you did say carried intention. You no longer felt compelled to defend your character to people who had already decided to misunderstand it. Silence became strategic rather than reactive. You understood that some truths are strengthened by being lived rather than explained. This restraint unsettled those who expected you to remain emotionally available to the past. They, meanwhile, remained bound to repetition. The same explanations resurfaced, the same grievances were rehearsed, the same rationalizations were recycled. This repetition was not clarity, it was captivity. When a person cannot move beyond their actions, they must keep narrating them. Each retelling is an attempt to control meaning, but meaning cannot be controlled when truth has been avoided. It only grows heavier. You also noticed how clarity reduced fear, not because danger vanished, but because uncertainty no longer paralyzed you. You trusted your judgment more. You trusted your ability to respond rather than react. This trust did not make you reckless, it made you steady. You no longer needed constant reassurance. You knew what you would tolerate and what you would not. Boundaries became internal rather than negotiated. They lacked this steadiness because their boundaries were external, maintained through control rather than conviction. When control slipped, anxiety surged. When outcomes were unpredictable, agitation followed. Being bound to past actions meant they could not adapt freely. Every change threatened to expose something unresolved. Movement felt dangerous. You moved forward because nothing inside you required concealment. Clarity simplified your emotional life. You still felt deeply, but you were no longer pulled in multiple directions by guilt, anger, or confusion. Emotions passed through rather than taking residence. Restraint allowed you to feel without being governed by feeling. This balance was not achieved by suppression, but by understanding. You knew what belonged to the present and what belonged to the past. They remained restless because their inner world had no such order. Past actions intruded on present moments. Defenses interrupted genuine connection. Peace felt temporary because it was never rooted in truth. You emerged with clarity because you faced what was real. They remained bound because they kept running from it. Justice arrived without revenge, through consequence rather than confrontation, and this was perhaps the most disorienting outcome of all. For a long time you may have believed that justice required action, words spoken at the right moment, arguments won, exposure made public, balance restored by force. This belief is understandable. When harm is done, the instinct to correct it immediately feels moral, even necessary. Yet what unfolded defied that instinct entirely. Justice did not arrive loudly. It did not announce itself. It did not even ask for your participation. At first this felt unsettling. There was no dramatic turning point, no moment where the scales visibly tipped. Instead, things simply began to align in quiet, undeniable ways. Situations shifted, patterns repeated themselves for those who caused harm, but with diminishing returns. Opportunities narrowed, relationships frayed. The same behaviors that once gave them advantage began to produce friction. None of this required your intervention. In fact, your absence from the process seemed to be what allowed it to unfold. Confrontatio. N would have bound you to the past. It would have required you to rehearse pain, justify yourself, and remain emotionally engaged with people who had already shown their unwillingness to be honest. Consequence, by contrast, required nothing from you. It worked independently, guided by the internal logic of actions and their outcomes. You stepped back, not out of fear, but out of understanding. You recognized that some dynamics correct themselves more precisely when left alone. There is a particular dignity in justice that does not need witnesses. It does not seek validation. It does not demand acknowledgement. It simply unfolds. You saw this in small but telling ways, how they struggled to maintain the same influence they once wielded, how their words lost credibility, how trust eroded where it had once been assumed. These were not punishments imposed from the outside. They were results generated from within the same choices that once seemed effective. What made this form of justice powerful was its inevitability. Confrontation can be resisted, argued against, reframed. Consequence cannot. It follows patterns rather than opinions. It does not care how persuasive someone is, how justified they feel, or how convincingly they explain themselves. It accumulates quietly, often unnoticed, until it becomes impossible to ignore. And when it does, there is no one to blame but the self. You noticed how restraint protected you from contamination. Revenge would have required you to adopt the same tools that harmed you: manipulation, cruelty, exposure. Consequence required integrity. It allowed you to remain aligned with who you had become, rather than reverting to who you were under attack. This alignment mattered. It kept your clarity intact. It ensured that whatever justice arrived did not cost you your character. They, on the other hand, expected confrontation. They anticipated retaliation, because retaliation would have confirmed their narrative. It would have allowed them to claim victimhood, to justify escalation, to frame the situation as mutual conflict, rather than unilateral harm. Your refusal to confront disrupted that script. Without an opponent, their actions stood alone. Without resistance, their behavior became more visible, not less. Justice through consequence also revealed something important about time. Immediate responses feel satisfying, but they are rarely precise. Time refines consequence. It allows patterns to mature fully. It exposes consistency rather than isolated incidents. Over time, what someone repeatedly chooses becomes impossible to conceal. You allowed time to do its work, not passively but deliberately. You chose distance over drama, patience over performance. This patience did not mean you were indifferent. It meant you trusted reality to reveal itself without your supervision. You understood that not every wrong needs to be corrected by force. Some are corrected by exposure to their own logic. When actions are left to echo, they return with accuracy. Not exaggerated, not softened, accurate. This accuracy is what confrontation often disrupts. It interferes with the natural unfolding of truth. You may have felt moments of doubt along the way, moments where silence felt like loss, where restraint felt like injustice. But gradually, evidence accumulated, not in headlines but in shifts. The people who once followed them grew distant. The confidence they projected became brittle. The certainty they relied on required constant reinforcement. None of this was caused by you. That was the point. Justice that depends on your effort is fragile. Justice that emerges from consequence is stable. Through this process, you learn that justice does not always restore what was taken, but it does restore order. It realigns cause and effect. It closes loops that confrontation leaves open. You did not need an apology to move forward. You did not need acknowledgement to heal. You needed separation from distortion. Consequence provided that separation without dragging you back into the fire. Justice arrived not as a moment, but as a movement. Slow, quiet, and irreversible. And because it required nothing from you, it left you free to continue becoming who you were meant to be, untouched by the need to prove anything at all. You walked away transformed, while they continue burning. Not in spectacle, not in ways that invite pity or applause, but in the slow, internal way that never grants relief. Transformation did not mean you forgot what happened. It meant what happened no longer occupied the center of your inner life. Memory lost its authority. Pain lost its voice of command. What once shaped your reactions now merely informed your understanding. You carried the past with you, but it no longer carried you. Walking away was not dramatic. It did not feel like victory. It felt like release. At first, release was subtle, almost disappointing. There was no surge of triumph, no sudden happiness. Instead, there was space. Mental space where rumination once lived. Emotional space where tension had been constant. In that space, something unfamiliar grew. Neutrality. You could think of them without heat. You could recall events without being pulled back into them. This neutrality was the clearest sign of transformation. Transformation altered your relationship with time. You no longer replayed conversations, rewrote outcomes, or imagined alternate endings. The mind stopped negotiating with the past. Energy that had been spent on internal arguments became available for present choices. This shift was not forced. It happened because there was nothing left to prove. You had already survived the worst of it, without becoming smaller. The future no longer needed validation from the past. They, meanwhile, did not walk away. They remained orbiting the same moment even as life moved forward. Burning does not always look like suffering. Often it looks like fixation. They revisited the same stories, the same justifications, the same grievances, refining them as if refinement could change their substance. The fire stayed because they stayed close to it. They needed it to explain themselves, to stabilize identity, to avoid looking inward. You noticed how transformation simplified your inner dialogue. Decisions became quieter. You trusted your instincts without excessive self-interrogation. Doubt still appeared, but it no longer dominated. You did not need to convince yourself of your worth daily. It had become assumed. This assumption was not arrogance. It was stability. When worth is settled internally, external noise loses relevance. Burning, by contrast, complicated their inner world. Every decision required reference to the past. Every challenge reopened old defenses. Growth felt dangerous because growth threatens old narratives. They could not evolve freely because evolution would require acknowledging where they had been wrong. Fire punishes avoidance by lingering. It remains present until truth is faced or collapse occurs. Transformation also changed how you related to others. You became more selective without becoming cold. You listened more carefully. You observed patterns instead of promises. You no longer rushed intimacy or trust. This caution was not fear-based, it was